All right, good morning, and welcome to week 9 in NETD2202 and another asynchronous class. This might be the last asynchronous class, I'm not sure, but we are going to do asynchronous one more time. So, a couple reminders: we do have an ICE and a quiz this week. So, the ICE and the quiz, the ICE will be on Thursday, and the quiz will be available all week. I will double check right after I'm done recording to make sure that the quiz is available for you. And this quiz covers classes and collections. Okay, so today we're going to give you a little demonstration on a new object that you haven't seen yet in Visual Studio called the data grid. And we're going to introduce you to the concepts of rows, columns, and filling in and populating this data grid. So we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to start a brand new project today and do this demonstration for you. Hopefully we'll get as much information across to you so that when we do our in-class demo on Thursday, that the data grid is not an issue, that we can actually get past that and work on the actual coding part of it. All right, so switching over here. So in here, we're going to start a brand new project. Add new project as per normal. Go ahead, choose our Windows Forms app. This is going to be week 9 demo 1, and this is going to be about the data grid. All right, go ahead and set that .NET 5 and go ahead. As I had said in class last week for you guys, if it does say out of support for .NET 5, don't stress, don't worry. That just means Microsoft isn't making any more updates for the .NET 5, and they're focusing solely on .NET 6. That does not impact this class in any way, shape, or form, as we will not be using advanced enough techniques to worry about that right now. Okay, so what we have here is we're going to have our blank form. So let me go ahead and do a couple things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to close this, rename it. All right. Yes, always rename your files before you do anything with them, because some of you have already experienced that trying to do everything and then cleaning it up at the end doesn't always work. It's not always the best strategy. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that back in again. The other thing that I need to do is from last Monday's video, I'm going to grab that trooper class that we were working on, and we're going to go ahead and use that in today's demonstration. So I've got that here under week 8 demo 1 here. I have this trooper class right here. You guys can't see that. Let me change my screen resolution. Hang on, let me see here. Go ahead and set that there. Keep changes. There we go. Okay, so you guys can see that now. So in your demo that we did last week, there's this troopers class. We're going to need this troopers class in this week's project. So we're going to go ahead and move this into this week's project just by copying it. Make sure the little plus symbol's there so it copies it. And there we go. We've got it in it. The only other thing we need to do is make sure that the namespace for that trooper class is the same as the form we just did. Easy way is to go into the form, view the code, grab this namespace right here. Then we'll go into the class itself and change the namespace to be the same namespace as the form itself, and that way we won't have to worry about qualifying that namespace. Okay, so back to the design here. We're going to do two things. One, we're going to go to the toolbox. Let's go ahead and view the toolbox. Okay, I'm going to pin it here because I use a few things from it. Okay, and we're going to grab we're going to first of all navigate to this data folder here, and we're going to grab this DataGridView. Okay, so we're going to grab this DataGridView and we're going to drag it onto the form, and you can see it just makes this big gray box. But this is in fact a grid which has rows and columns, and it will look sort of like an Excel spreadsheet. It'll or a data table in a database or whatnot. All right, so with this data grid, there's a bunch of stuff we can do. We can predetermine what the columns are going to be, and we can link them and those kind of things. I'm not going to do that yet. We'll do that in a minute, but we're not going to do that yet because I want to also show you how it will automatically work as well. Okay, so if I go to this little arrow in this top right corner, Okay, so I click on that. You can see there's lots of stuff. I can edit columns, add columns. You can actually edit data directly inside this data grid. We will not be doing the writing aspect of the data grid in this course. You'll be covering that in the NETD2202 course. Okay. But we will be doing the read part of it. So in order to show columns and those kind of things, but you can in fact have this as a table and actually edit the data right in the table, which does make it for a very useful user experience in a lot of business case scenarios. Okay. So anyway, so for now you can do that. The other thing I want to point out here is that there's a data source. So you can set, okay, what is the data source for this project? Now you can create data sources as separate objects and those kind of things, and we'll do that. And again, you will do that in NETD2202. We're going to programmatically create our data source in this course and making it extremely simple. So all I really want to do is just throw this grid on the form. I'm going to snap it to the top corner, snap it to the right here, set my properties. So I'm going to anchor this to the top left and right like that, and that way now it stretches and moves with the form. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple buttons here from the common Windows forms here. Grab one button here, which is going to be let's go ahead and rename this button here to be button get data, just for lack of a better name. All right, and on the button we're going to say get data. Right, and that's all that's going to be for now. Okay, I will also might as well go ahead and add an exit button as well. I'll put this on the bottom right here. Okay, I'm going to anchor this to the bottom and the right, so it'll always be in the bottom of the right. This will, so I just set the anchor here to the bottom of the right. Sorry, that was behind my head. And then the name here will be btn exit. The text will be exit. With an ampersand on the X, and then I'll double click on that exit and basically say application.exit. Okay, we are just working in a single form for this one, so we do not have to worry about that. We will go ahead next week and change our application into a multiple form. So we're sort of going back and forth a little bit here, but if I go straight to the multiple form application here, it does get extremely confusing. So I want to stick to a single form application to get through this classes and data grid stuff, and then next week we'll move this to separate forms. Okay, so application.exit, that's fine at this point. Okay, and then we're going to have this get data. Now what this get data is going to do is it's going to go ahead and retrieve the list of troopers and populate the data grid. Okay, so if we go to the trooper class that we created last week on the Monday, we had created a static method here, I believe, called get sample troopers, which essentially just allowed us to get a list of troopers returned, okay, based on as many samples as I wanted to put in the data. I put 3 samples here, so our list will have 3 troopers in it, enough data just to sort of see if it's working. So this will return a list of troopers. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go into the main code here under the get data button, and we're going to say this. Oh, wait a minute, I got to rename the data grid. Okay, so we have data grid here. Right now, this data grid is going to be called DataGridView 1. That's a bad name. So we're going to call it DGV for our Hungarian notation, DataGridView, DGV, and I'll call it DGV Troopers. Okay. There we go. Don't forget to name your objects. All right. All right. Let's go to the main form here. We're going to go, okay, DGV Troopers dot data source, okay, is going to equal trooper dot get sample troopers. Just like that. One line of code. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to go into my Solution Explorer here, set this project as my startup project. I also want to set this form to be center screen. There we go. And that way when I run it, it should run on the right screen and whatnot. And let's run this and see what happens. Crossing my fingers. All right. So there's our form with our big ugly gray box. But when I say get data, all of a sudden we've got a table. and it has 3 troopers in it that were made completely programmatically. And you're like, wow, what just happened? Where did all that data come from? Like, what is this? All of a sudden, we've got a full table with all the data we have for the troopers. And I only wrote 1 line of code. This is the beauty of the .NET framework, that there are so many tools built into it that you can take advantage of. And I just created literally, I mean, I was talking all the time, but literally in less than 5 minutes, I created a form that is completely populated with data, columns and tables and rows and data with get data buttons and exit buttons and everything. And it literally, if I wasn't talking, I could have done this in less than 1 minute. All right, rapid application development. All right, so let's go ahead and look a little bit more in depth to what's happening here. Okay, so what's happening here is we created a trooper class last Monday in the demonstration video. So when we created this trooper class, we have the typical properties. Okay, we have the typical properties, the 8 properties. We have the constructors, so we can create each individual instance of that trooper anytime we want to. Okay, and we have the 2 different constructors, where we have the default constructor and we have the parameterized constructor where we're putting things in. Remember last week I showed you about the auto numbering too? You'll actually see it working today. Okay, so we had set this auto numbering feature up for the designation, so it wasn't that you had to enter the didn't have to enter the number, it would just create the number for you automatically. So we created that last week as well. Then we created some instance methods, which were just set defaults, change units, some basic things that will apply to individual units. Okay, but then we made the static ones where we had, okay, get some sample troopers. This is the one we just had. Change the unit, but this change unit wasn't changed based on the current trooper. It was based on change any trooper. So I could say, okay, send in the designation, find that trooper. So we found that trooper, and then we changed this unit, right? And then we had the idea of finding the trooper, and I showed you little tricks with the arrow notation. So the arrow notation you will get to know as you learn JavaScript and some of those other languages. Extremely handy for shortcutting all of this code to that, right? So this arrow notation has some great connotations in shortcutting your code and those kind of things. Okay, so what we did is in the get sample troopers, what you need to see here from the detail perspective is we created a generic list. So this is a generic list or a collection, all right? And it's a list of type trooper, which is the class type. Okay, and we are just saying, okay, our return list will be a new empty list of troopers. So we're instantiating this return list to be a new empty list of troopers. And then we're adding 3 troopers using the constructor, the parameterized constructor, each time adding 3 new troopers, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and then once we've added those 3 troopers using the parameterized constructors and the collection.add method, we can then go ahead and we're just returning that list. So this return list is a list of troopers. Okay, so in the main form, this get sample troopers will result in a list of troopers. The data source for the data grid view can be any collection. Okay, any collection. And so obviously the generic collection of type of list is a generic collection, and it will even populate the columns automatically based on the properties. So this is a list of class objects, and the class object has properties. And so those properties become the columns. So this is how everything gets tied together. So when you create classes and you have the properties of the classes, then you create a list of multiple instances of that class. You can then use that as a data source for grids. Combo boxes also have a data source, but the only difference with a combo box is a combo box only has 1 column. Okay, so that you have to specify a a list. So an array of strings or a list of strings would be a great data source for a combo box or a drop down list, if you want to call it that. Okay, so that's sort of the idea. So you can do this. What we should have probably done here, because we do have in the trooper class under the global variables, we did create this global variable called list of troopers. What we should probably do is take that list of troopers and add, so take this list of troopers, so this troopers variable here, and add the sample troopers to it. So let's do that right now. So in the code here, when I run this get data, rather than having the data source just be the get sample troopers, I actually want the data source to be the generic list of troopers, like the actual troopers one, which is the global variable within the troopers class. So what we can do is we can go ahead and say troopers, okay, troopers.add, sorry, we have to say trooper.troopers. So trooper.troopers.add. Now there's add would be adding one at a time. Add range actually allows you to add more than one at a time, and it adds it to the end of the list. Now right now the list is going to be empty. That troopers list is going to be empty, so we're just adding things to it. If it already had 10 troopers in it, for instance, I could then do add range, and I would add another list of troopers to it. So I can like combine two lists of troopers together, and it would put the second list at the end of the first list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the troopers and add range to it, which is essentially going to be the sample troopers. Okay, and we need a semicolon. So we're going to take the troopers and add the sample troopers to it. Now what I can do is set the data source to trooper.troopers, and that way whenever I add or change a trooper to the troopers list, the data grid will match. Okay, so let's go ahead and run that and see that this small change, now I say get data, we still get that data. But rather than the data being pulled from the method saying get sample troopers, this time we're pulling that data from the generic list of troopers, which is sort of our main list, our main storage place of where we're going to store those troopers. Okay, that makes things real life a whole lot easier. Okay, so let's go ahead and create a little method to add one more. Okay, on Thursday we're gonna have a full-blown editor and do everything together, and I'm gonna give you guys a sample project to start from. But for today we don't have any edit screens or anything. I'm not gonna make one in our little 45-minute class, so I'm gonna go ahead and just hard code this. But let's go ahead and see how this works. So we're gonna exit this application. We're gonna add refresh my designer here because it always does that. All right, there we go. We're gonna add another button. Okay, so I'm gonna take this button and stretch this out a bit and change its properties to be, instead of get data, it's get sample data. Okay, like so. And then we're gonna put a second button here, which is gonna be add one new row. Okay, something like that. Let's stretch it out a bit there. Let's rename this to be button add row. Okay, this is just going to be some hard coding fun, so not the way we ultimately will do it, but just showing you how this works. Okay, so add one row. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and add one row, and what we're going to do here is we're going to say trp equals new trooper. Okay, and we'll go ahead and create a new trooper. Now I'm gonna cheat here, and I'm gonna go down in here to where we did the sample troopers, and I'm just gonna copy and paste all this into here, and we'll just change these names. We'll change this to George. I didn't have a George already. I use George all the time, right? No, George, right? George was this. So we'll have George, and he's gonna be from Endor. I gotta spell Endor right. There we go. We'll change that birth date to 65 03 07 he will be on team orange, so it'll be a new team. He's not going to be that. This needs to be a type trooper, sorry. And then we'll change the color to have black hair and blue eyes. Okay, so we've got that. Okay, so we're creating a new trooper. Now what we can do is we can say trooper.troopers.add, and we're going to add the new trooper we just created. Okay, there we go. We've got an extra bracket in here. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so when I hit this add row, we're going to instantiate a new trooper and add it to the troopers. Now, what I'm looking for here is that our DataGridView's data source is set to the troopers. So after I set the data source, what happens if I add a new trooper? Does the data grid automatically update itself, or do I need to force it to update? That's what I'm looking for here. So I go ahead and I run this. As I get sample data, there's the 3 rows. Okay, and then I'm going to say add new row, add new row, add new row. Okay, so nothing's happening. Now what has actually happened is it did create 3 new rows because I clicked on it 3 times, but the grid is not being updated. So I need to force that grid to update. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a private void, a little custom function here called update data grid. Okay, just like so. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that the DataGridView data source is equal to null. Okay, I'm going to set it to nothing. That way it'll wipe it out. Okay, and then I'm just going to reset the data source back to the troopers again. So I'm going to wipe it out and then reset it again, which means that when I have this line up here, I actually don't need to set this data source. What I can do is just call update data grid, like so, right? And then what I also need to do is when I add a new row, I need to call update data grid, like so. So get the data, update the data grid, add a row, update the data grid, and the data grid wipes out the data source and then resets it back to the troopers again. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. Form 1, get sample data, add row, add row, add row, add row, add row. Also, note while we're here, look at the auto numbering working. The auto numbering is working pretty good, right? So you can see how that works. So you can see that we're go ahead and we can add rows, but we have to manually or in code force the data grid to refresh itself. It doesn't have, it's not a live connection. It's a static connection. So you set the data source, it's set. So every time you make a change, you have to tell the data source to reset itself. Okay, so that's why I created this little function, reset itself. Now, one more thing I want to show you before we call it a day. Well, a couple things. Okay, we'll show 2 more things. First thing we're going to do is we're going to show you how to manually set up the data grid in advance. Okay, so because right now when I run this, the columns are here, but look at the column names. The column names are the property names, and they're not English user friendly. Like, they're literally the property names. So you have is defective or homeworld. Like, we've made pretty, like, these ones aren't bad because our property names are good, but sometimes your property names will be like coded property names, right? And so then your column names are going to be like variable names. And that's not what we want. We want them to be good English names. So let's start off with something like nickname. We want a space between nick and name. All right. So how do we actually get the column name to be user friendly or user experience friendly? So if we go into the designer, we'll go back into this little tiny arrow at the top, and we're going to go ahead and add a column manually. So we're going to say add column. Okay. We're going to call this column nickname. Okay. And we're going to set the header text here to nickname. And we can see also what kind of column is this. Well, this is going to be a text box column. You can see you can have drop downs, buttons, checkboxes, and different things that are there. Anything that's just a string, or a number or anything is always just going to be a text box column. It only really matters for for being able to edit the data, okay? But to be able to see the data, we're just probably going to use Checkbox Column for most of them. The is defective, we'll probably use a checkbox, okay? So it's checked or not checked type of thing. So, but anyway, so we have the type there as a tick. Now, one of the things I want you to see is that in the settings of this, okay, so we're going to go ahead and add that column. So we've added that column nickname. And how does this affect the data source now? Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll close this form, right? And we've got this column, right? So if we run this now, as we've got a column pre-programmed in, you can see that there's the column's there by default right away. And then I can say get sample data, okay? But notice that there's no data in that column. So it didn't automatically connect them together, okay? So we have to figure out, okay, I created the column manually and I want to connect the property of the trooper class object to that column. So it still created another nickname column here, okay? So what we need to do is we need to go into the columns, okay? You can go in here, you can say edit columns, you can click on the prop. Now, when you're in edit columns this way, you see that we have this window and we have a little mini properties window in here. And it's really important here that you set the data property name, okay? The data property name, okay, will have it. If you have pre-programmed the data source, then this will actually populate with it. But because we did it in program, so we did it programmatically, we actually have to type this in. So this needs to be the identical spelling and capitalization to the property name itself. And that will link this column, so this nick space name column, to the nickname property, okay? So if I take that now and run this and get sample data, you can see that the nickname no longer creates an automated column, okay? It no longer creates that automated column, but it populated my manually created column with the data. Cool? So we can go ahead and do that for each of the columns if you want to do it. So I'm just going to do it for a couple so that you can see. I'm not going to do it for all 8. It'll take too much time. But if I go ahead and I edit columns, let's add a column here. We're going to call this designation, or let's just call it ID. Okay. So it's going to be, actually, we'll call the column called designation because it needs a name. Okay, so designation. But the header text will be ID. Okay, it's going to be a text box column. So we'll add that. Okay, close this. And then in this properties window here, we're going to set the data property name to be designation. Like so. Again, identical spelling to the name of the property in the class definition. Like so. So we can do that. Let's go ahead and add another one. This time we're going to do the checkbox just so you see how it works. So we'll add the column name to be is defective. The header text will be defective. Okay, just the word defective. And then we're going to change that. Actually, let's change that to be a, rather than a text box column, let's change that to be a checkbox column. So it's now a checkbox column. Data property name is still here. Again, the exact spelling of the class property name, like so, is defective. And there we go. The other thing is I want the ID to be the first column. So you can resort the columns in whatever order you want. And you just click on it, and then you can use these arrow keys to move it around. So you can put them in whatever order you want as well. And let's go ahead, okay. There we go. We've got our data grid, our 3 columns set up. You can even go in and set the column widths. So for instance, the ID column, I maybe only want this to be 50 wide, like so, okay? And you can see now it's a lot thinner because I don't need it to be that wide. And maybe I can stop the horizontal scrolling. So you can see there it is, get the sample data, and it populates. I didn't quite make it small enough because I still have a little scrolling here, but you can get rid of that if you set all the widths manually. But you can see I have all the same columns, just these 3 are coded the way I want them to be, and these are just using the automated generation. I believe, let me just see if I can find it off the top of my head. if I go into the designer here, I have to wait for a second to reload. Okay, if I go into the designer and I go to the properties of the data grid itself, there's a lot of properties here, but one of them, if I remember correctly, is to auto-generate columns. Okay, so let's see if I can find that. I see here generate member. Let's see if that, I don't think that's the right one, but let's see. Okay. Data member, data source, that's fine. Allow. Okay. Let's see if that works. I don't think that was the right property. Let's just double check. All right, so now I had set it to generate the member, so it actually doesn't generate the data source now, so it actually causes a big problem. So that's not the one I wanted. That's not the property I was looking for. All right, so let me just go ahead again and turn that back on again. I don't want to do that. I believe edit columns. There was somewhere here, I can't remember. Collection. I can edit the collection from there. Here, I'll move my head out of the way so you can see that. There is under miscellaneous, there's a columns choice here in the properties, and you can hit on the buttons to bring up that same menu. That's the same menu you bring up when you do this, right? Edit columns, same thing. Two different ways to get to the same screen. But somewhere in here, I might not be able to find it right away, is the idea to tell it not to generate those columns by default. All right. All right. Cool. The other thing I want to do is we'll find that afterwards, and I'll show you on Thursday. The other thing I want to show you now is how do we click on the grid and know what we've clicked on. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change a couple settings in the property grid. The first thing I want to do is change the selection mode. Okay. Right here. So right now the selection mode is row header select. Okay. What I want to do is I want to say full row select. So when I click anywhere in the row, the whole row gets selected. Okay. Then what I want to do is I want to change the multi-select here to false, meaning I can only select one row at a time. Okay. So I'm going to say selection mode to full row select and the multi-select to false. And that will allow me to select one row at a time. Let's see how that works. Let's see if that's what I wanted. So I'll run that, get some sample data. And now when I click on it, you can see the whole row gets selected. It still knows. Notice that the columns are highlighted based on what column I've clicked on. So it knows what column I've clicked on. And there. And you can see I can even edit data here. But now this won't actually do any editing. Okay. Because it will... I haven't written the code to do the editing. Anyway, so there we go. We've got that. So now, how do I know what row I've clicked on? Right? So the first thing I need to do is I need to find the event. And it'll be a click event. Okay? But let's find which event. So we go into the events here, and you can see there's a cell click, cell content click. You have to be careful with cell content click. Cell content click is really troublesome because when there's text in the cell, you actually have to click on the black part of the text. If you click on like the space in the middle of an O, it will not trigger. Like you literally need to click on the text itself. So that's really troublesome. We almost never use that one. There's cell move, cell double click, cell click could be there, but what if I clicked on the row header over here? That's not a cell, right? So what I want to do is I want to look through these, and I think the one I want, there should be a selection change. Selection change. There we go. So we can deal with the selection change. This has good things and bad things. So there's some problems with this as well. But we're going to go ahead and do selection change. Okay. And we're just gonna call this selection changed, like so, and we'll tab out of there. It created this selection change one. Notice it added this automatically, so it is an event. What we want to do is we want to just create quickly just a string of what's in that box. right? And let's just say the designation, right? We'll just get the designation. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we're just going to use a string. We'll convert it to an integer another day. But for now, we're going to create a string called desig selected, okay? And this is going to equal DataGridView troopers dot selected rows, okay, because I've selected one. And it's going to be the first row selected dot selected rows square brackets, my bad, 0, okay, dot cells. So within our selected row there's many cells, so we want the first cell because the first cell contains the designation. If I go back to the design here, notice the first column is the ID column, so that's going to be 0, okay, dot value, okay, dot toString, okay, like so. Now there's going to be some issues here. And the issues are going to be, excuse me, the issues are going to be surrounded with that this selection changed event is going to get triggered several times. Every time you change the data source, it will change the selected changed object. It will trigger it. So right now, okay, let's put this in as a message box. So we'll go message box.show, and we'll literally just put in the desig, not design, the desig selected, okay? We'll just show the message box of that is. So you'll see every time a message box comes up, that you know that this has been triggered, okay? So we'll go ahead and run this. And you can see right away we get an error. And the reason why we get this object not inst of an error is because when we didn't even get to see the form, when we call, when the grid gets created, okay, or when we change the data source, we are also changing the selection. So for instance, if we set the data source to null, there are no rows in the table. So what is selected, right? So we've got to really be careful, because if there's no rows in the table, then this is a selection changed. If I had a row selected and then I reset the grid, so I said there's no rows, that will deselect the row I've got selected, which is a selection change. It's not, selection change doesn't mean I've selected a new row. It means I've changed what the current selection is, which could also include deselecting anything. So I really have to say, okay, first of all, I have to say if dgv.trooper selected rows.count is greater than 0. Okay, so I have to do that first to make sure that I am not trying to choose a row when there are no rows selected. Okay, so that's first and foremost. Okay, then what I want to do is I want to make sure that sorry, let's see if this works. Okay, so we still got this problem. So it's still trying to say, hey, we're trying to select rows and it's not set as an object. Okay, so that's sort of the idea here. So what we need to do is we also are going to introduce a global variable here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create a global variable. And we're just going to call this a Boolean variable. Okay, call this a Boolean variable. Okay, and this will be do selection change. And we're going to set this to false by default. Okay, so it won't do that right away. Then what we're going to do is on the update data grid, we're going to set that to false. And then we're going to set it to true right after we update the data grid. Okay, and I don't need the bool here. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and set this to false and then set it to true. So every time we update the database, the data grid, we are going to say don't do the selection change. So what I'm going to do is in here, I'm going to say do selection change and, okay? So if selection change is true and the selected rows is greater than 0, then we'll go ahead and do this. So I'm going to set this to false to start. And then every time I update it, I don't want to trigger this event. I'm going to trigger it anyways, but what I'm going to say is when I trigger it, I'm not going to do anything. Okay? Let's see what happens now. Let's run this. And you see now we didn't get that error. I can get the sample data. Okay? I did not get, even though now I have a row selected by default, I did not get a selection change. But now when I click on this, I get the correct designation of the row that I've clicked on. Okay, let's add one row. Remember, every time I add a row, I'm running update data grid, of which I've turned the selection change off. So this, because it's inside this if statement, this does not happen. Otherwise, this is going to cause an error every time. Okay, of which I would then have to do a try catch block and all that kind of stuff. So I can now click on each one of these and it gives me the correct designation, which is pretty cool. Okay, so that's sort of the thing you want to do. The other thing which I want to do as well is I want to say nothing is selected. Okay, so I'm going to go DataGridViews dot clear selection is a method. Okay, so after I update the data source, I don't want, remember when I ran it a second ago, that first row was automatically selected? I don't want anything selected. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that selection. Clear selection will trigger the selected changed event. So again, I need to turn it off and put it in between the turning it off and the on so that this will trigger don't do this. All right, we'll run this. Go ahead, get the sample data, add a bunch of rows, and now notice that if I click here, it gives me 5. But if I add a row, nothing is selected. Okay, let's run this again. Let's show you that again. Just so you see it. Last time, when I hit, so notice there's a row selected here. When I say get sample data, last time that first row was selected. Now there's nothing selected, so I can actually click on that row right away. Last time, because it was already selected, I couldn't click on it to select it. So the first row wasn't even an option for me, which is not a good user experience. So now I've got that so that I can go ahead and click on each row and understand what I want. What if I wanted to print out the home world? Okay. So what I could do is I could say here string home world. Okay, actually we'll put it in lowercase, is equal to DataGridView troopers dot selected rows, the first of the selected rows, cells. Now the home world is in the 4th column, which is index 3 dot value dot to string, like so. Okay, and then I could say plus home world. I could do that, right? Something like that. So let's see how that works. So I can go ahead and get the sample data, add a bunch of rows, click on that, and notice that, oh, wait a minute. Home world's actually the 3rd column. So it should have been index 2. So we're getting the dates. Okay. So we got to be careful that it's got to be a 2. All right, let's run that again. And get some sample data, add a bunch of rows, like that. There we go. Endor, Rex, Endor, Ugly, Hoth, Clint, Tatooine. Okay, see how that's working? So it's pretty good. So you can determine what the data is based on the user interaction, which is pretty cool. So that's sort of the idea. So again, the selected rows is a collection of the data grid. Rows is a collection, selected rows is a collection. Then within that selected row, each one, because I've used an index number here, now I've gone to a single selected row because I've specified a specific index number. So then I can say, okay, what are all the cells in that row? And the cells is a collection within each row. And then I can say, okay, I want the first cell, so I can give it an index number. And then I have to do .value, but value comes back as a generic object. All right. So I then have to convert that to a string or convert it to whatever else I need. Okay. We'll cover decimals and numbers and all that stuff another day. But for now, there's the data grid, getting data into it using the data source, manipulating that data source, adding things on the fly, refreshing the data grid, and as well as knowing what you've clicked on and using the selection changed event. All right, that's it for today. Don't forget Thursday's class, there will be an in-class exercise, so we will see you all there. Okay.